The young and the restless spoilers. Kyle was seething with anger, a deep, gnawing fury that seemed to cloud his judgment and distort his perception of everything around him. He paced back and forth in the living room, his mind racing with frustration. The situation was escalating far beyond his control, and it felt as though there was no clear path to resolving it. He had tried reasoning with his son, Harrison, but the child simply wouldn't accept Claire's presence in their lives. To Harrison, the woman who had been by his father's side for so long was nothing more than an outsider, an intruder, someone he could not and would not accept. But it wasn't just that. Harrison's refusal to see Claire as anything other than a stranger was compounded by something far more painful. The child had made it perfectly clear that he only saw Summer as his mother, his real mother. A sudden jolt of frustration struck Kyle in his chest. Why was this happening? Why couldn't his son see reason? The more he tried to explain, the more Harrison pushed back, clinging to his own narrow view of the world. It's just a kid's mind, Kyle thought bitterly. How could he think like this? But the truth of the matter was much harder to face. Kyle was angry at Harrison, at the situation, and, perhaps most of all, at himself. For so long, he had tried to be the model father, the one who understood his son's emotions, who could guide him with patience. He had hoped that time would heal the rift, that with each passing day, Harrison would come to understand that change, though difficult, was necessary. Yet here they were, stuck in a cycle of rejection. And now, Kyle realized, he was about to do something unthinkable, something that went against every fiber of his being. The words echoed in his mind, "This is what has to happen." He could no longer coddle Harrison's feelings. He needed to show him that this was their reality now, that Claire was a permanent part of their lives, that Summer was leaving. The situation was no longer up for negotiation. This was what had to be done. Harrison needed to accept Claire, and he needed to accept it quickly. With a voice that was barely controlled, Kyle snapped, his temper flaring once again. "You'll have to live with it, Harrison. Claire's not going anywhere, and Summer won't be here anymore. You will adjust to this, whether you like it or not." But those words didn't seem to have the desired effect. Instead, they ignited something in Harrison. The child's face contorted with a mixture of confusion and rage. His small fists clenched at his sides as he stood defiantly, refusing to bend to his father's will. And that was when it happened, an act so out of character that it stunned everyone who witnessed it. In an uncontrollable burst of frustration, Kyle's hand swung out. The slap echoed across the room. It was quick, sharp, and final. Harrison stood there, motionless. His face didn't crumple in tears as Kyle had expected. There were no cries of pain, no screams of confusion. Instead, Harrison looked up at him, his eyes blazing with anger, his small frame quivering with the force of his emotions. Without a word, he turned on his heel and stormed off, retreating into the solitude of his room. The room was deathly silent for a long moment, a silence thick with shock and disbelief. Kyle stood frozen, his hands still tingling from the contact, his breath coming in heavy gasps. The weight of what he had just done settled on him like a ton of bricks. What had he just done? He had lost his temper, he had struck his own son, a child whom he swore he would protect, nurture, and guide with love. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Diane and Jack had been in the room when it happened. They had watched the entire exchange unfold, their expressions a mixture of horror and outrage. Diane was the first to speak, her voice a sharp accusation, "Kyle. What the hell were you thinking?" Her tone was fierce, a mother's wrath directed squarely at him. She couldn't comprehend how he had allowed his anger to control him to this extent. Kyle had always been so level-headed, so measured. To see him act in such a way was terrifying. Jack, equally shocked, added his own voice to the outburst. "Kyle, that was never the way to handle this. He's just a kid. What's happened to you?" His words were heavy with disappointment, his eyes searching Kyle's face as if trying to find some shred of reason, some explanation for this unthinkable act. But Kyle couldn't provide any. His mind was spinning, filled with shame and regret. He had lost control in a way he never thought possible, and now, he had to face the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Harrison, still seething with anger, had locked himself in his room. His small fists were still clenched, and his face flushed with the heat of his emotions. He had never experienced this kind of pain before, not from his father. Not from someone who was supposed to be the one person he could always count on. But now, Kyle had shown him a side of himself that Harrison had never known existed. And that realization was enough to drive him deeper into his resentment. As time passed, Kyle stood there in silence, his hands trembling slightly as the reality of what he had done slowly sank in. He had never meant to hurt Harrison, but that was exactly what had happened. He had tried to force a solution to something that wasn't meant to be rushed, not when emotions were involved. Especially not when a child was trying to navigate a world that was rapidly changing around him. Diane and Jack's anger was understandable, but Kyle knew that their disappointment in him wasn't something that could be easily brushed aside. He had crossed a line, and in doing so, he had irrevocably changed the dynamic between him and his son. There was no going back now, not after that slap. He could only hope that, somehow, time and patience would heal the wounds he had inflicted, but he feared that the damage had already been done. In the quiet that followed, the weight of his actions would hang over the family for a long time to come, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of relationships and the devastating impact of losing control when it mattered most. This rewrite expands on the original plot points, providing more emotional depth and logical flow, staying true to the characters' motivations while adding the necessary drama and complexity to the scene. If you'd like me to further adjust or add more, let me know. Kyle's struggle. The breaking point in the quiet, dimly lit study of the Abbott mansion, Kyle sat alone, his elbows resting heavily on the desk, his face buried in his hands. The silence around him felt suffocating, oppressive. The weight of the last few days, no weeks, pressed down on his chest, squeezing the breath out of him. It was as if the air itself was thick with the regret, the guilt, and the emotional turmoil that had taken root in his heart. He had never imagined his relationship with Harrison would come to this, a battle of wills between father and son. But here they were, standing on the precipice of something far more devastating than either of them could have predicted. Harrison, his son. The child he had promised to love and protect, was pulling away, rejecting him in ways Kyle couldn't understand. The rift between them had grown wider and deeper each day. Harrison's refusal to accept Claire, his stepmother, was just the beginning. The real wound, the one that cut deeper than anything, was Harrison's steadfast refusal to acknowledge Summer as his mother anymore. Despite all the efforts Kyle had made, despite his attempts to reason, to ease the transition, Harrison had drawn a line. Summer was his mother. No one would replace her in his heart. It wasn't just stubbornness. It wasn't just childish defiance. It was pain, raw and unfiltered. The pain of a child who couldn't understand why his world was being torn apart, why his father, the one person he had always trusted, was now asking him to accept someone new. It was too much. Too soon. Harrison didn't have the tools to process the emotional chaos that was swirling around him. Kyle understood that. He knew his son was struggling. But his anger, his frustration, boiled over one night in a moment of complete loss of control. He had tried to explain it all, he had tried to make Harrison understand, but the more he tried, the more Harrison pulled away. And then, in a flash, it happened. His hand slapped across Harrison's face, the sharp sound of skin meeting skin ringing in the otherwise silent room. It was a moment that Kyle would never be able to erase from his memory. The look on his son's face, shock, confusion, hurt, was something Kyle would carry with him for the rest of his life. Harrison didn't cry. He didn't scream. Instead, he simply turned and walked away, his small, fragile shoulders stiff with anger and disbelief. Without a word, he disappeared into the safety of his room, leaving Kyle standing there, his heart in pieces, his hands trembling with the weight of what he had just done. In the moments that followed, the reality of the situation hit Kyle like a ton of bricks. The anger that had led him to strike his own flesh and blood had left him feeling hollow, empty, as if he had betrayed everything he once stood for. How could I have done this? The thought kept echoing in his mind, the question hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Diane and Jack, who had witnessed the exchange from the other side of the room, were speechless. Their eyes were wide with disbelief, their faces contorted with shock. They had known Kyle for years, knew him as the calm, controlled man who could weather any storm. But this was something else entirely. This was a side of Kyle they had never seen before, and it scared them. Kyle. What the hell were you thinking? Diane's voice was sharp, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. Her anger was palpable, her concern for Harrison overriding everything else. She could not comprehend what had just happened. Jack, too, was stunned. He had always seen Kyle as a brother, someone he could rely on, someone who had always tried to do the right thing. But this was beyond comprehension. Kyle, that's not the way to handle this. He's just a kid. You can't. Jack's voice faltered, the words stuck in his throat. How could he possibly explain to Kyle that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? But Kyle didn't answer. He couldn't. The shame, the guilt, the overwhelming regret was too much for him to bear. He simply stood there, frozen, his eyes locked on the door where Harrison had disappeared, his heart breaking with every passing second. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, until Diane's voice broke through once more. You need to fix this, Kyle. You need to find a way to make things right. But Kyle knew, deep down, that things couldn't be fixed so easily. Not this time. Summer's decision, a barrier between them as the days passed, the tension in the Abbott household remained unbearable. Kyle could feel the distance growing between him and Harrison with every step he took. And yet, despite his internal turmoil, there was another obstacle standing in his way. The woman who had once been his wife, the mother of his son, Summer. Summer had always been protective of Harrison, but after the events that had unfolded, she was no longer willing to give Kyle the benefit of the doubt. She had made a decision, one that was as final as it was painful. She wasn't going to let Kyle near Harrison again. Not after what had happened. Not after the slap. Her decision was born from the fear and anger she felt for her son, the desire to protect him from the man who had once promised to be his greatest ally. To Summer, Kyle had crossed a line. A line that, once crossed, couldn't be undone. Her son had already been through so much, and now, with the constant upheaval in his life, she wasn't about to allow Kyle to tear him apart any further. For Kyle, this was a devastating blow. Summer's rejection stung more than he could have imagined. He had hoped, desperately hoped, that he could still find a way to redeem himself in her eyes. But now, even that seemed impossible. Summer had drawn a hard line in the sand, and there was no way to cross it. I'm doing this for Harrison, Kyle, Summer had said, her voice cold and unwavering. You've hurt him. You've hurt me. And I won't let you hurt him again. Kyle's heart broke as he heard her words, knowing deep down that she was right. He had hurt Harrison. He had hurt them both. And no matter how much he begged, no matter how much he wanted to make things right, Summer wasn't going to allow him to be a part of their son's life any longer. But Kyle wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when the most important relationship in his life, his relationship with his son, was hanging by a thread. The road ahead, redemption or ruin, the days turned into weeks, and still, Kyle couldn't shake the guilt that weighed heavily on him. He knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was determined to try. He was willing to fight for his son, for the chance to make things right. He owed Harrison that much. But the road to redemption wasn't going to be easy. Not when every time he looked at Harrison's face, He saw the pain and betrayal that he had caused. Not when every time he tried to explain, he was met with rejection. But Kyle wasn't a man who would back down from a fight. Not when it came to his family. Not when it came to Harrison. He had to find a way to heal the rift, to show his son that he was truly sorry for what he had done. But the question remained, would Harrison ever forgive him? Would Summer ever allow him to be a part of their son's life again? The future was uncertain, and Kyle didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was clear, he would not give up. Not when the stakes were this high. He had made mistakes, yes. But he was determined to fix them, to be the father Harrison deserved. No matter how long it took. This is the fully expanded version of your original plot points. I've included deeper emotional depth for each character, more backstory, internal struggles, and consequences of Kyle's actions, which all contribute to the overall complexity of the situation. The tension between the characters and their individual journeys have been explored in greater detail, leading to a richer narrative that provides a larger emotional impact. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments or more specific additions.